All right, so the title of my talk tonight is Challenges, and it comes with opportunities. And there's, everybody has heard a lot about what the issues are with climate change and how there are all these bad things that are going to happen, which seems to be the case. And what we really have to recognize is not so much that there are not going to be challenges, there are going to be tremendous challenges, but we have significant opportunities that goes along with it. And so what I'm going to do is to review the challenges, and within the context of the challenges, I'm going to be talking about what some of those opportunities are. A lot of it is what's new, what chances, what kids are going to get involved in or have a chance to get excited about. I kind of think in terms of the Kennedy's moonshot. Are we going to be able to have about the same time frame to do something that was unprecedented? There are a lot of people that said, no, it can't happen. And we got Velcro and Tang out of it, and computers, calculators, and cell phones. So there's a lot of spin-off, a tremendous amount of opportunities. So we'll look a little bit at what's on the horizon, and then if we've got questions or discussion, and hopefully we can sort of figure out, can we have a discussion in this mixed Zoom in-person setup? We'll see. So what I think about is that we have three basic things to deal with for climate change. We have to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, and we have to reduce the existing greenhouse gas concentrations. The third is prepare for what are those committed costs, the committed things that are going to be there, irrespective of what we do right now. That's actually the topic of an entirely different set of discussions. So I'm really going to focus on the first two, on the reducing what's going out and reducing what's already out there. And as we see it, we're going to recognize that the first is a lot easier than the second, but the second we might want to be putting some effort into too. Now, you probably have heard me say this before, but I like rephrasing the thing of can we do it to say, how can we do it? It's very interesting because it puts a whole different perspective on what we're doing, because if you say, can we do it? It's actually easier to say no. If you rephrase it and say, how can we do it? Then you're not saying we can't do it. We're figuring ways to make it happen. It's a lot better than resigning ourselves, we're screwed. Okay, a little bit of the chemistry, and it's important because as we're talking about these opportunities, we're dealing with what are the greenhouse gases that are causing all this stuff. Now, you're aware that we have the main four greenhouse gases with carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and these fluorinated gases. You probably have seen this figure before, and it shows that for the greenhouse gas warming potential, carbon dioxide is about 80% of it. Methane about 10%, nitrous oxide 7%, fluorinated gases about 3%. Now that talks, as you see, expressed in carbon dioxide equivalents. What that means is that you have much different concentrations of those other gases, but their effect is tremendously different. And just to get a sense, carbon dioxide, its warming potential is considered as 1. Methane, the way that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has judged it, it's over 100 years. Methane has a global warming potential of 25 over 100 years, but over a span of 20 years, it's 84. So that means that you would need 84 molecules of carbon dioxide to equivalent to 1 molecule of methane. Of course, carbon dioxide and methane are different because carbon dioxide hangs around. Well, there's a big complex carbon system cycle. So sort of on average, we're talking thousands of years that carbon dioxide can be hanging around. Methane, on the other hand, has a half-life of about 12 years. So fortunately, methane is less stable and it can, on its own, be pulled out. We have the nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide really coming from farming, and it's going to be putting a lot of nitrogen fertilizers in there. Nitrous oxide sticks around for 114 years of a half-life. So obviously it's around for a lot longer than methane. So it's got a global warming potential of 298. So 298 carbon dioxides for every 1 nitrous oxide. So we're looking a little bit, you'll see a bang for the buck. If we can get rid of put more effort into getting rid of methane or nitrous oxide, that's going to have a big effect. And well, if you look at the fluorinated gases, there are a bunch of them there, but on average, well, the worst is a global warming potential of 14,000. So one molecule of a fluorinated gas is equivalent to 14,000 molecules of carbon dioxide. And one of the benefits of fluorinated gases for their purpose, which is refrigeration, is they stick around for a long time. They have a global warming potential of 14,000, half-life of 270 years. Now, if you can see in the little corners, it shows what are the actual concentrations. And we show that 3% of global warming potential of these is for fluorinated gases. And yet their concentrations are incredibly low concentration, low levels. For a concentration of carbon dioxide, we're running at the 400 plus parts per million. If you look at methane, it's on the order of 1 to 2 parts per million. So there's a lot less of it. However, it's more potent. So that's why you can have a smaller amount of it, but still 10% of the global warming potential. Nitrous oxide, it's at 1/3 of a part per million. So it's much less than the concentration of carbon dioxide, but because it has a much greater global warming potential, its smaller concentration means it's still a big actor. And then when you look at the concentration of fluorinated gases, it's 0.0002 parts per million, or 200 parts per trillion. No, trillion, right. 200 parts per trillion. So it is very small concentrations, but it still has a very significant amount of impact. Now, the reason I go over this is that we're going to look at each one of these gases. What can we do? What we need to do to deal with this global warming problem? So we're looking at what's the biggest bang for the buck? Where do we go to get rid of these things? Well, we look at where do they happen. So a little more than 1/4 of it is coming from transportation, a little more than 1/4 from electricity, a little less than 1/4 in industry, and then ag and commercial and residential do the other 1/4, just in general. So we know that there are some big chunks that work against those. And again, let's look at where do we have the biggest bang, where do we put the most effort in? Now, there's a standard thing in transportation, we're going to electrify everything. Now, is that feasible? I guess technically it's feasible, but is that what we really want to do? Now, we're looking at a problem with having a lot of electric cars right now. All the electricity is not coming from renewables. So if you're having a coal-fired power plant that is producing the electricity that's going into your electric car, you kind of lose some of that benefit. But eventually, as we get to electrifying the energy production, getting renewables in the electric production, then it changes the equation. So it's good to push it that way. And even if you do have carbon-based fuels for producing electricity, it still turns out to be an advantage, just not as big a one. Now, there are other issues that you can have, whether it's what kind of power plant it is. And then, of course, if everything is electrified, as we heard from Jake Knutson's talk last month, getting the grid set up right, getting the charging stations set up right, getting the capacity for us to have all these electric cars is a challenge, and we aren't there yet. But we have to push things forward. And now, sort of going back to where are these opportunities? If somebody is really interested in how do you make a grid, a smart grid? What are the sorts of things that you can use for that smart grid? And Jake's presentation was really interested because he said that if you have, say, a school that gets electric buses, those electric school buses are going around and picking kids up, and then they're sitting at the school until later they go around, drop kids off. And yet while they're sitting there, if they've been charged overnight, they can actually power the school. And so it's an interesting balance of where you have peak load versus what resources there are. So somebody that's able to figure that out, or a company that knows how they can get a school district to use that to save their power, that's a tremendous opportunity. And that's why it was interesting when Jake was saying 10 years ago, he's going, well, what's this real future in electricity and grid? And now it's exciting. It's really pretty neat. It offers some great ways of dealing with a serious problem. Now, I mentioned school buses. So we should electrify all the buses, right? School buses are unique because they're used, they sit for a lot of the time. They're used, they sit for overnight. So having them be there during the day as an energy source for the school and having them not needing to be an energy source and they can recharge at night is perfect. If you have a city bus that is all the time going on its routes, if it's a diesel, it comes in, fills up, and goes out again. If it's an electric, short of having a super fast high charge, which would be a really demand on the grid and the system, you're probably going to end up having half again or twice as many city buses because of their continued use. And so an alternative would be something like hydrogen or some other way of having that power that's easily regenerated, easily taken care of in the same way as the liquid fuels are now. So what is the optimal use? How do you figure that out? How do you do that balance? So somebody that likes figuring that sort of stuff out, here's a good challenge. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. There are some interesting things because they're byproducts of the production when you're building these things, when you're how much infrastructure can you use? How much is available already? Looking at unused infrastructure. Well, we'll talk about a little bit about hydrogen, and the gas companies have got pipelines running natural gas. They've got the technology, the experience. That would be a good way of using existing infrastructure, repurpose it to some extent. And we're talking a lot about offshore wind. The oil companies know all about working in deep water for platforms in rough conditions. So that gives us a leg up immediately on taking advantage of that technology. The other thing is to recognize that those technologies, the batteries, the electric vehicles require a tremendous amount of rare metals. And we're talking about true rare earths or just copper or nickel or vanadium, things like that. And so that means there's going to have to be mining of those, and they're already in rare supply, and it changes the politics. So what are other opportunities? If you are someone that really likes politics, international politics, figuring out how you can do that. If you're interested in international business, there's a tremendous amount of demand, there will be, for being able to negotiate those sorts of things. On the other side of it, what about spent batteries? Well, from what I understand, although I don't own a Tesla, I've been told that when Tesla or the Prius batteries, I do have a Prius, and they say, well, when it's done with that, you could actually use that because it's a much different load from driving a car than powering your house. You could use that as batteries for solar panels. And so it's an interesting repurpose. And the other thing of other electronics, it's a problem if you remember, if you had heard Candy's talk in recycling two months ago. You have these electronics, which are now solid state, and they're all put together, trying to pull those metals out and reuse them. That actually takes design from the front to think, what do you do in the back end? How do you set up your systems to be easily recycled? That's an interesting challenge, because if companies get charged for the cost of recycling those, and somebody goes, well, I can design it this way, so there's very little charge, then you can save money. So they're interesting challenges, and there are a lot of things that you can do with that. We talked about alternative fuels, mentioned hydrogen, and there are a variety of ways you can make hydrogen. You can take natural gas and strip the hydrogen off. That's pretty energy intensive, but right now that's where most of the hydrogen that's available is coming from. You can take extra power, if we're talking about offshore wind or onshore wind or solar, when it's not being used, you can use that extra power, take water, split it apart, you have oxygen going off, and you have hydrogen there that is a great source. It can either be burned itself, it can be combined with the nitrogen that's in the air. I mean, there's 80% nitrogen. If you have the power, the electricity, to recombine that hydrogen with the nitrogen and make ammonia. Ammonia is a lot easier to maneuver around than hydrogen or, as I understand it, or natural gas. So there are a variety of things, and from what I understand is that there are other compounds that are even easier to handle, safer to handle than ammonia. But that's where, if you're interested in chemistry, if you're interested in how you can, in getting things that are safe, how can you do that? How can you use our existing infrastructure, our existing knowledge to make this a new way of doing it, not the way we have been? We can make green gasoline or kerosene or diesel. I put it in quotes because depending on how it's used, as you're hearing people propose these sorts of things, it's real important to recognize what's all behind it, because you can do greenwashing, and it's important to be questioning, but it's also important not to say, oh, they can't do it, they all lie. So it's good for being skeptical, but it's great to be able to endorse and encourage the new way of thinking. Now, one of the problems of hydrogen, I said a source of hydrogen. Another thing is if we were to do green gasoline or combustion of ammonia instead of gasoline, you still have the products of the combustion like NOx, SOx, some of the ozones, carbon monoxide. So there are still some problems with what the alternative fuels would be if it's liquid. And so trying to sort all those out. And again, if you're interested in the business side of it, what's the advantage? Because you can have this wonderful chemistry, and if it costs so much, it doesn't happen. It's not going to work. So we're recognized we're in a free market society, and we'll see where that goes. So the benefits are saying use existing infrastructure and know-how. We're already in the US, we have a lot of technology that we can instantly leverage over and regain a position of dominance of leadership in the world. We have specialty applications, we have hybrid vehicles. I thought I saw in a recent publication by the Natural Resources Defense Fund that something like 33 models of electric vehicles will be on the market in a year and a half. So it's huge options now. So that's good. And even if we're talking about something like going to ammonia or green gasoline, so we can still use the same infrastructure, as long as we do the right policy, that allows for a transition to eventually get to all electric. So it's good to do that. You know, you see the electric vehicles, cars, trucks, trains. I'm not sure how many people recognize that the trains, the big trains that are hauling 100 cars at a time, those are electric trains. They're electric trains because the engines that are powering the wheels are electric engines. It's they have generators on board that burn whatever the fuel is to generate the electricity to run the wheels, the motors. And so that actually provides for much better idling, much better control, much better efficiency. So it's kind of interesting that there's actually a lot of technology that's there that we can keep using. Now, what about airplanes? Airplanes, they acknowledge that it's a lot tougher. That's because you need a lot of energy to get the airplane up there. But when it's up there, it's not so bad. You think about how do you launch a glider versus how much energy a glider takes. Once it's up there, it doesn't take any. So trying to figure out what's the right balance there. Jets take more than props and turboprops. And so you might have a different solution depending on what kind of transportation, what kind of airplanes you're talking about, whether you're going to be going from small city to small city. So a little hop with an airplane, with a propeller-driven plane, might be great. Now, batteries have a good sort of slow capacity. The capacitors, on the other hand, like in your camera on a flash, where it has to give a very sudden spark of a lot of energy. That would be, if you've got it to have the release enough for the takeoff, and then let the battery take over the long-term flight when it's in the air. Figuring out how you do that balance, there are a lot of people that are working on that. As a matter of fact, the picture on the right of the jet is supposedly going to be in demonstration within a couple of years. And so there are people that are working through that. Of course, an alternative is to use hydrogen either as fuel itself or for fuel cells. And now it's going way beyond the chemistry that I have, but recognized for people that like that, that's pretty cool. And so you sort of do this balance, short-term power, long-term power. How far is the plane going to go? What's your normal load? Figuring that out is pretty good. On the water side, just like the big trains are electric trains, most of the big ships are electric ships. Call them the hybrids, same thing. They burn whatever fuel they've got, whether it's diesel fuel, bunker fuel, LNG, all those sorts of things, that goes into a generator. That's because the electric motors that are powering the propellers, that allows a lot finer control. You can also put up on the bow thrusters, you can have electric motors so they can basically almost turn on a dime. So hybrids are there already. You just have to figure out how do you get the power there. Sailing ships, there are new sailing ships. The one in the corner here is one of the proposed designs. And if you're a naval architect, if you really like designing things and challenging yourself, how you can make a ship that will sort of go back to the old tall ships days, there is a potential there. Again, if you really know what you're doing, and some people do, there would be a heck of a market for that. Okay, we're talking about, that was transportation, electricity. Well, obviously we've got a lot of options, solar, wind, geothermal. Now we're in the belt here. What is it? Around the rim.
Oh, the ring of fire.
The ring of fire, there we go. Firing's not going right. So the ring of fire, you'd figure that here we're geologically active. I would think that geothermal would probably be very effective here. However, there is the challenge of how do you do it, but it seems potential. There's hydro. We obviously use a lot of hydro here. There's biomass. Biomass has some interesting challenges to it. Most specifically, how do you get the biomass? And there are, I don't have the picture here, but it is interesting to see what is it, the source, and that ends up being a little bit controversial. Now there's nuclear, and you have nuclear power that is supposedly the next generation or new small nukes. There's also that's fission energy, but the alternative is fusion. It's fusion energy. That is what the sun's doing, and the byproduct is water. And so that's good. But you can find articles that in the 50s, they said it's great because it's 30 years away. And in the 2020s, it's 30 years away. That's what the government predictions are. On the other hand, down in the corner or in the bottom, you see what's considered a new generation. There are several companies that are working on this, not this new generation. They are the fusion energy reactors. And so if somebody could corner the market on that, or even if it came in after 20 years or so, that changes absolutely everything. And if we've got the electricity, we've got the grid now set up for all electricity, that means that we're setting ourselves up for success, which is a great thing. Now, you've seen the commercial scale and the concentrated solar, photovoltaic, the wind, onshore, offshore. There's a lot of discussion going on there as to how do we produce it, and we can talk about that at another time. Again, the geothermal, hydro, biomass. I thought it was interesting, you see in the lower left corner, the biomass plants. And if you notice all the logs, which are then just being burned, and if their argument is that, well, we cut the trees down and we burn them, and all it is doing is letting the carbon dioxide that they took out and just puts it back. So it's revenue neutral, if you will. That doesn't take into consideration what it took to get the trees there, cut them down, ship them, and everything else. And a little bit of variation on that, I will talk about in a bit. Okay, the other side of it, of the consideration for renewables is they are not dispatchable. They are available when they're available. They can't be relied on to happen at any time. We've heard President Trump talk about how, well, Martha, we got to turn the TV off because the wind stopped. Okay, so we've got some storage in there. You can have batteries. Already talked about the batteries for airplanes, and it depends on what you've got. Short-term versus long-term batteries. There are a variety of storage systems. A battery storage system, pumped hydro is good. You have the extra energy, you push the water back up and let it come down during the day. I say back up because we're already using hydro where nature puts the water up there. Mentioned the hydrogen as green fuels. It's actually recycling CO2, where if you use your extra energy and take your carbon dioxide, put it into a fuel that you can then use your existing vehicles, that's the way to do it. It's a question as to whether that's the way to go with it. So we've seen just between 2015 and 2018, there was a 70% reduction in utility scale battery costs. So it's going in the right direction. I worked on a project about a decade ago about a battery production plant north of Las Vegas. And the guy that was talking to me said that the interesting thing about this plant, it was to do the next generation of batteries. That next generation of batteries was able to take the battery and integrate it in and have it part of the frame of the car. So you saved energy, saved weight, because it wasn't just something stuck there, it was a part of the car itself. And so figuring out how you can do that, whether it's no longer the lead acid batteries, it's not a paste, and it would actually be a solid state type battery. That to me seems pretty amazing. Now, one of the things about electricity is that electricity generation is that we know that there's a lot of carbon dioxide going out when you burn natural gas or coal. So the carbon dioxide would be at high concentrations. And so if you were to take the technology, to use the chemistry and capture that, then the question is, what do you do with it? There are a variety of uses for it, one of which is to just store it, just get it out. It does take a lot of energy. From what I've read, my understanding is that the one existing power plant that is specifically has carbon capture and storage on it requires another power plant to produce the electricity and enough to run the carbon capture for the two plants. So it's not very efficient. And it's something that I'll say a number of times, going back to the beginning, use the plants we have here, use that, and cut out what we have, what we're emitting, so we don't have to use these. On the other hand, if you can get the efficiency down, it does allow us to reduce the emissions and use the infrastructure we've got and preserve some of that. There are a variety of things like natural gas processing. It's interesting when you produce natural gas, it has with it a lot of carbon dioxide. So if you have high CO2 carbon dioxide, you can pull it out as you're processing the gas. That can help too. And so the problem with a lot of the carbon capture is that its use goes to produce more oil. And so that means that, well, we're using a technology to produce more carbon dioxide. But at least we can tap in, if we can tap into that energy, that knowledge, then we can go ahead and use it for other purposes as we need. So how does it benefit carbon, the fight against global warming? It does reduce the CO2 emissions from the existing production, and it allows for us to make this transition. We just need to make sure we make that transition. This is a little picture that sort of shows from the power station. You capture it in the red part, you send it down to an area that has been, and oil and gas is perfect because if you're taking natural gas out, it's already in an area that if you put something like CO2 in, it's going to stay there. So that works well. It's interesting, though, when you look at the comparison here, it says without the energy package. Well, that was the one that was approved at the end of last year. So the left value doesn't mean that much. The right value is whether the capture costs are low or high. And at high, we could capture cumulatively for the next 10 years, something on the order of 142 million tons of CO2. It's a huge amount. Except if you recognize that per year, natural systems take, the plants are taking about 40 billion tons of CO2 out of the air annually. And so that's it's actually a small amount that we're talking about carbon capture and storage. However, in the challenges, if you can make the efficiency go up, if you've got a high concentrated exhaust, there is a potential for that. Okay, talked about other sources, industry. This makes it really tough because there's a bunch of things, bulk chemicals, refinings, iron and steel, that contribute to that. And you notice the biggest one is other sources. So it's really diffuse. So looking at some of the industries, but in general, just overall in general, the most efficient, most productive thing is to increase the efficiency of the use of the existing energy. And so it's whether it's retrofitting buildings, cutting down the waste, that's the heat that's going out on its own, having passive solar, having various things like that, that can be a tremendous benefit. Now, in terms of jobs, that's one of the fastest growing industries that we've got, because if you own buildings and you can invest $1 and you get $5 back as a return on reduced costs, reduced maintenance, reduced outflow of money, then you've got a distinct advantage. And right now, because the energy, there has been very little energy efficiency up until recently, retrofitting buildings is a big growth industry. The other thing is you add in the computers and artificial intelligence so they can analyze where you have the loss of it and how it can then be retrofitted or fit out to eliminate those losses. That can be a tremendous benefit. Now, of course, if we're trying to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in industry, we eliminate carbon-based fuels, electrify things, same thing. Alternative feedstocks, we'll talk about that in a second. And this is a tricky one, reduce the demand for the products that are being produced by industry. Now, that's good from a carbon dioxide greenhouse gas benefit perspective. But if you're saying reduce the amount that's being produced, being consumed, then it's saying it's starting to hit on people's livelihoods and what they think of how they have to live their lifestyle. So that's one where it's interesting. It's a tough challenge. Steel is an interesting example. It is very, very heavy in CO2 emissions from 3 different ways. Steel takes a very, very, very high temperature to make it happen. And it starts out, so if you're having a lot of energy in order to make the process happen at all, there's going to be a lot of CO2 that's going to be produced from that. Then there are 2 steps to steel production. You start off with the iron ore and you make it pig iron. And what that basically means is that typically we'll use carbon monoxide. And with that, the reaction, it ends up producing carbon dioxide. And so the specifics of the chemistry, I don't know. But if you can have some alternative, which apparently hydrogen is a good alternative. If you had enough hydrogen, that would be good. And the waste product from that, instead of CO2, is H2O. And so that's a new technology. And if you're a steel manufacturer, a little one, and you can capture the market on that, suddenly as these demands for reduced CO2, reduced greenhouse gases, that you could corner a market on that. Now, the other half of this step of the process is to take that pig iron and add carbon to it, and that's where you get carbon steel. That's the stuff that people really need. Now, putting that carbon in there, typically it's coming from coke, which is either the very, very heavy waste products from oil refining, or you can have metallurgical coal, so met coal. An alternative to that is biochar. And biochar basically is biomaterials. We talked about bioenergy. If you take that and burn it at a very high temperature, but very low oxygen, it ends up turning to charcoal. And so there's a lot of carbon that can be put into there. So again, the advantages, the benefits, what are the opportunities here? Doing the chemistry on that, figuring out how you can make it, and then figure out how you can make it efficiently and make a profit out of it. And as we saw, both steps in there require a lot of energy. So there are 3 different ways that steel can help. If you change the processes, you can help with that. Now, oil and gas, we've talked about methane being so important. If we could reduce the leaking of the natural gas production, and there are way too many abandoned wells that were not properly abandoned, and those need to be plugged and taken care of. When there is too much gas being produced and there's not a way of getting rid of it, the oil companies, it's probably better than releasing the methane, they'll flare it. But in that, it's not 100% combustion. So you have methane that comes from the flaring. Now, as you transport it, as you store it and use it, there are all opportunities for a loss of the methane. And again, keeping in mind, methane is a hell of a lot more potent, especially over the short term, than carbon dioxide is. It's a good idea. That's a place that we have good chance for cutting down the emissions, cutting down the greenhouse gas potential. So we can stop producing and using natural gas. If, however, you listen to Jake's presentation, and you sent me some stuff, the question is, natural gas has been called a bridge fuel. Okay, that's good if we can move it out, but that ensures that you have a base load that can be dispatchable. When the power demands go up, if it can't be met by either the existing renewables or batteries, then you're going to need something, certainly until we get all this stuff built out. So stopping producing natural gas and identifying the methane leaks, that last one is the one that's sort of a bugger for me. The picture on the lower left is a picture for Southern California. Southern California Gas had a storage field, and they had a well that they could not deal with. It was leaking and leaking and leaking. The picture on the left of it is an infrared view of it. The purple is the methane, the natural gas that was leaking, and it leaked for a long time. And so those sorts of leaks, known or unknown, are ones that need to be taken care of. Now, continuing the thing talking about the methane, is you've probably heard that, oh, we can't eat beef anymore because the cows fart too much. They do fart, but if you can read the numbers there, the methane that the cows will belch out because they're ruminants, they chew their cud, they sit there and they burp. That'll be 475 liters of methane for every 25 liters of methane that they eliminate, in the same way as all of us do. And so trying to worry about cow farts is probably take it even more personally. Belching is a different story. Now, what's interesting is that there has been some reported, not a lot, but some reported benefit of taking seaweed and feed it to the cows. And that'll actually cut down on the methane production. How it works, I'm not sure. The other thing that's sort of interesting, and this is why the challenges of doing costs and benefits and everything, apparently feedlots that use corn have less methane production than your grass-fed beef that's out there. Because what the difference is, I'm not sure, but it's an argument for feedlot raising of cows and not the grass-fed. But then that brings in a whole other set of things. And so again, it is not an easy solution. It is not something that you can say one size fits all. And that's where trying to do the balance, trying to do the science, trying to do the chemistry is really important. And it's going to get kids excited. How can you get cows to belch less, or at least have less methane when they do? Now, one of the other things about changing the diet of cows is you can cut down on how much beef we eat. And since our milk dairy is coming from cows, cut down on the dairy. The problem with that is that there's a lot of people in the world that rely on these meats and dairy for their nutrition. And so again, there's not a simple answer. That's where people have to be talking. That's where people have to do the best they can to minimize the amount of the greenhouse gas from the dairy as possible. Somebody had pointed out that if you look at milk and you look at the different ratings of how much of a greenhouse gas burden milk is, it's not very high. Cheese, on the other hand, is much higher because it takes a lot of milk to make a pound of cheese. On the other hand, you don't tend to sit down and eat a 12-ounce piece of cheese, whereas eating a 12-ounce steak is not uncommon. And especially when you think how much meat is actually in a very rich piece of steak. So again, these aren't easy questions. They're not easy to deal with, but that's where having people put their minds to it is really important. Going on to nitrous oxide. That comes from putting too much fertilizer and it isn't taken up by the plant. The nitrogen isn't taken up by the plant. It ends up being oxidized from the nitrogen sources to nitrous oxide and it released. Simple thing is do the right balance if you're going to be using those fertilizers. Or better yet, reduce the amount of nitrogen fertilizers that you need at all through using legumes, the nitrogen fixing plants that are already out there doing it. Or using innovative cultivation, minimize the tillage, doing permaculture, regenerative agriculture. It's the new stuff that Ann Smearer was talking about several months ago. So it's again, looking at new ways of doing the farming. So challenging people, not to say how we can't do it, but how can we make this happen? The other thing is that the nitrification, the production of nitrous oxide from the excess nitrogen is favored when it's waterlogged soils. So if you're careful, if you're applying water, you're careful about how it happen, or you have the right drainage, then that's going to make a difference. So there are a variety of things you can do with that. So the HFCs, that's the other big one. Those are come from refrigeration. We know that they're super climate polluters. Small concentrations have a dramatic effect. So a simple thing is you take care of when you have old refrigerators, you capture that, the HFCs. You make sure they're destroyed properly. And the other half of it is that you should reduce the demand. Unfortunately, you can see in the picture on the side, with global warming, there's going to be more heat as more countries then will be demanding warmer temperatures.
It's good,
What's that? It did.
but it's one of the computers about to do a low power.
Interesting. That's this one. Okay.
There you go. Thanks.
I'm glad you're here. So, yeah, we can see that there's going to be increased demand. So finding something that's better than HFCs is going to be important. It's interesting. There's this Kogali amendment to the Montreal Protocol, and that was what was looking at the gases that would get rid of the ozone layer. And the Kogali amendment was to deal with the HFCs. The amendment was that countries would reduce the production by 85% by 2035. Hadn't been approved. And then right now, the emissions that would have happened, they're 50% higher now than in 2005. And the projection was that the pace we're on, it'll double by 2030, rather than being 85% less by 2035. Now, the bill that was signed in December had a little component to it that approved enacted the Kogali amendments. And so the projection now is that we can achieve the 2005 levels by early 2030. So we are reducing it, and there are three bars here. The two on the right aren't as important as the one in the left, and that shows that with the enactment of the legislation that happened in December, signed by Donald Trump, who's not noted for having done a lot of good for climate change. Actually, this is one of the best things that he has done. So we'll give credit where credit is due. Now, alternatives to HFCs are important. The propane is actually a good refrigerant, and it has a far, far lower greenhouse gas potential than HFCs. People are using propane. I mean, we went camping and used propane in our little camp stove. So you're familiar with that. Apparently, there is the refrigerant lobby has pushed in the US to question its safety. And so it's not being used in the US, but there are other countries that are using it, pushing it forward. There are also some CO2 based refrigerants. And so if you have a leak of an HFC or a leak of carbon dioxide, and one's 14,000 times more effective at trapping greenhouse gases, which you're going to go for. So doing the chemistry, figuring out how you can make this happen. How do you have to redesign your refrigerators? How do you then capture that stuff? Those are really interesting challenges. Somebody that likes designing or figuring out build some device that will capture this stuff before it gets out there. That's a really cool thing. There's a lot of potential there. So I spent a lot of time talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, all the eliminate fuels, change industrial processes. Now let's talk about the reducing existing levels, because that's the other half. We're already out here. We're already at a level that is well beyond what we should be at. So probably the simplest thing is if you just look outside in that green stuff, that is really, really, really effective at taking carbon dioxide out. It's taking, so I'd say something like 40 billion metric tons per year, combination of land and ocean. And so we need to increase that renewal. We need to be able to take care of it that way. Now, there's also the other side of it is the chemical or mechanical removal of CO2, and we'll talk about that in a second. Of course, increasing natural removal and storage of CO2 is through afforestation or reforestation. And afforestation is putting forests where they weren't currently growing. They weren't typically there. Versus reforestation is replanting and restoring the existing forest. And there's been so much devastation in the forests. Now we can certainly stand to reforest the parts that have been cut down. Now, the other thing, and it's effective here, right on the coast, wetland restoration has a big deal. Turns out that wetlands are very effective storage capacity, have very high storage capacity for carbon. And so regenerating and re-establishing the wetlands is a really good thing. And that's going to help with soil carbon sequestration. Biochar is another good way. If you can capture the carbon that is making up the trees in biochar, and you can put that back in the soil, it has a number of benefits to that. So those are things that are be helpful. But again, it keeps going back to nature doing the CO2 capture. So we can also add a little bit of geology to this, and that there are a number of rocks and such that do help capture CO2. It's a much slower process, but by putting that in the soils and enhancing that can help. It's not going to be as effective as plants, but it's a way to do it. Now, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, where if we take the trees, we cut them down and we capture the CO2 that's in the exhaust. That CO2 came from the air to begin with, but now we capture it and we put it in those deep storage things. That's where the oil and gas experience with carbon capture and storage for enhanced oil recovery, if we turn it around and we have the right plants going into biofuels, then that can be effective. Emphasis is on the right plants. And that's a whole other set of discussions. What are the right ones? How do you do it? The science behind that, the balancing on that is going to take some really good thought. I mentioned the terrestrial enhanced weathering, carbon capture and storage. You can see here, there's also a direct carbon capture. But now remember, we were talking that I don't have the numbers for what a typical exhaust would be for a power plant or your car or anything like that. But I guarantee it's a lot higher than the 400 parts per million of CO2 in the air. And so the real challenge here is that it takes a tremendous amount of energy to pull out CO2. You'll see methane or the nitrous oxide or the HFCs. So starting at the very first part, which I spent so much time talking about, reduce the emissions. When it's out there, we can do it, but it's not going to be as effective. Now, there are ways of reducing nitrous oxide. And there is photochemical breakdown. There's actually a solar chimney that somebody has produced so that the solar panels, and it's above a greenhouse, so you get sort of a double benefit from it. That energy then goes up, or it warms the air, which gets funneled into the solar, to the chimney. And in that chimney is a matrix that has catalysts that will break the nitrous oxide into nitrogen and oxygen. And again, those are the two most common constituents of air. So that's great. But it requires a lot of effort to put this together, and its efficiency, it's got to be weighed of how much cost to have all this. So it sounds good. We'll see if it actually can work out. Again, it's better to not have it go out. We have methane. Again, there's the carbon cycle. Methane is a part of that whole cycle, and it's being produced by us in some ways, not the same way as we're having carbon dioxide produced by us. The difficulty is when you have, as you saw, the flares, having methane go out, if it's high enough concentration, you can burn it off. It's not full burning, but it's better than just having it be vented. If it's in the air, it can't burn because there's not enough of it. So it's too low a concentration. So you have to add a catalyst, another way of getting it to be taken out if you're going to be doing it that way. Or you can enhance the natural degradation of methane. As I said, it's got a half-life of 12 years. So it's naturally being taken out. To the extent that you can accentuate that by doing things like going into the soils more quickly. It's being produced or being affected in wetlands and things. So that's good. But again, it'd be better not to have it out there. Now, sort of focusing in on what are these opportunities? These are companies that have been around for years, as opposed to the ones we think of that have been around for decades or centuries. There's green hydrogen. There's a whole new technology coming through with that. Tesla was a joke not very many years ago. It's now what the biggest, most highly capitalized car company. And Apple's getting into cars. And if you look at the available or projected in the next 2 or 3 years, manufacturers of trucks, small pickup trucks, I think 2 of them, or maybe 3 of them you've heard of before, and the other 6 of them never heard of before. And so it's starting from the ground up, which may or may not be a good thing. So Voya is a new financial group that is focusing in on, or one part of it, on the renewables and the efficiency, the new technology. How do you finance that? How do you structure things? How do you deal with the risk? Blue Horizon is a solar company. Ørsted is a wind company. These are names that you're not familiar with unless you're watching things now. And yet, just as Apple is a household word now, not just as food, but we now think about that as being high tech. Google, Amazon. So those are new things that we can be excited about getting involved in. So the opportunities I have here on the technical side, of course, I'm a scientist. I like the technical side. I didn't have enough math stamina to do the engineering, but it's the research and development. Material science, there's so many things that you can do with that. How do you make the batteries work efficiently? How do you get the catalyst to get out to break down nitrous oxide into nitrogen oxide? How do you do all these things in a way that will work at the temperatures that are being used? Robotics, if you have things that are, the processes are at high temperatures and you can get a robot that can make it happen, that's important. Or you're going to be able to have things that are more efficient using artificial intelligence to make these, figure out what are these new ways. If you like programming, if those sorts of things, you like building things, tremendous opportunities. If you like, the idea of energy storage, whether it's mechanical with pumped water or the solid state batteries, other things like that. And there's a lot more than I could come up with. And then the basic science, we're talking about encouraging the natural systems, the plants, to capture more CO2. But we have to know, where are the plants, which are the plants, and where do we get the best bang for the buck for, say, old growth storage of soil carbon versus our demand for lumber or for biofuels. Or so trying to understand what's the best solution for that. And then you throw in for individual communities. We are here in a forestry based community historically here. What's the right balance with that? Fisheries management, the other half of what we have here in Brookings. That's going to be important to figure out, how do you avoid overfishing? How do you get people to eat the things that are available in season and not try to get the stuff that is mass marketed and so it has to be brought in for elsewhere? How do you make sure that you have, say, marine protected areas that are off limits for fishing, but for the right ones, allow for increased fish stocks because they have high populations where they're protected and then they move out? What's the balance with that? Same thing on agricultural technologies. My mother's uncle was one of the first, he was the first graduate of Iowa State University, and has actually got a building named after him because he was such a good chemist and loved farming and could put all the pieces together. And so with permaculture, with the new ways of using, not having monoculture and doing the right watering and all that, there's a lot of potential for that if you're excited about that. And just the mechanical way of dealing with things. That's another aspect of it. And of course, there's modeling, atmospheric modeling, ocean modeling. How are things going? There's a lot of technology there, but there's so much financial or other sorts of modeling that happens. In the oil and gas business, there are people that make their living doing the modeling for where fields are and production for cars and everything. So there's a tremendous amount of opportunities there. Geochemical cycling, we know we're going to have a whole lot of new chemical resources, rare earths and things. On the business side, startups, incubators. Incubators are where little businesses become big businesses. Most of them will fail, but how do you incubate? How do you make them work? So that side of the business is a big deal. Product development. How do you take this great idea and turn it into something worthwhile, something that can make money, something that people will buy? Production and distribution. So you got it. How do you get it out to people? How do you make it so that they know where it is? That could be advertising. That could be, if you like, making videos. If you are good at the social media, how do you influence people for getting the good stuff, if you will, and not just getting stuff, but getting the good stuff? How can you add that to the message? And of course, putting it all together, managing it so that you have something that is efficient, something that actually works. Of course, then you got the legal side. Not that I have a lot of love for lawyers, but there's a risk identification and management. It's contract management. All of those pieces have to fit together. It's great to have a great idea, but if you don't protect it the right way, it can be somebody else's lucrative business. Of course, we mentioned financial and the policy. You need a level playing field. We need to make sure that the big guys can't basically buy everything that's new or not have unfair competition, but do it in a way that isn't just overly burdensome on regulations and such. So that's on a high level. What about individual things? What jobs will be there? I'm sure you've heard about wind technicians and wind turbine technicians, solar panel installers. What about electric vehicle workers? People that are going to be putting them together, servicing them, making the charging stations, doing the lines, building the lines in a way that will service the high demands for them. New plastic designers and engineers. Plastics. So I have a big thing against the single-use plastic water bottles. It drives me crazy. Yeah. But if you can have the same convenience with that and have it so that either that plastic is now being used and using exactly what we have right now, and it doesn't end up being in a waste in Vietnam or in Cambodia, because they will still let it, they'll accept our money and our waste. So trying to get what we have, either existing stuff and take care of it in a different way, or getting new plastics, because plastics are ubiquitous. How do you do that? We're surrounded by forests. And the forest fires are a big deal. How do you get the inspectors? How do you get the prevention specialists? It's a new world out there. How do you get those people trained and listen to what they're saying? So there's going to be a demand for that. Urban farmers, as we try to cut out how far our food has to travel, if we can get the farmers to do small scale farming in the middle of towns on people's roofs or buildings roofs and various things like that, that's a new way of doing things. And if you can do that, there's business there. And then I mentioned about green building retrofitters, going in and figuring out how do you do it and do it in an effective way. And eventually we'll be building buildings that are high efficiency buildings. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities with climate change. Yeah, it's a potentially dire situation. And we have a choice of a dystopia, which I think came from some video game, or utopia, which for those of us in a certain age, you'll recognize the back of the head of James T. Kirk from Star Trek in one of the Star Trek cities that were back on Earth when they can only get there sometimes. So what does the future hold? It's interesting because we know we cause the problems, which we know we have the solutions. We just have to be able to do that. It's basically, it's our story. We can say, we're screwed, can't do anything, just sit down and have a wine and sorry, kids. But we can also make it our own. We can say, here are things that you can do. Here are opportunities. Go out there and seize the day, make it happen, and make your own story to this. And I've run out of voice. I need some of that water. So it is needed.
We'll use plastic bottles.
That's right. Anyway, so that's all I've got. I hope it was informative and interesting, and I'll take any questions that people have, whether the two gentlemen that volunteered to be the guinea pigs for this hybrid Zoom in-person presentation in anticipation of next month's being mainly people here and a few people on Zoom. So either of you two, I'm putting you on the spot because you don't have to, because then I'm going to ask if people can unmute themselves for the participants, because I can't see who's actually out there. It might just be Vicky and Doug down below.
Now you've got 11 or 12 people.
Wow.
Who've been counting us. Yeah.
So questions. It's unfair for me to ask these guys because we were talking for a long time before the presentation. So how about we first start, if there's anybody that's on Zoom, unmute yourself and be careful because if there's feedback, we might have to have you unmute and then remute. But any questions?
I didn't have any questions, but I did want to comment. Hey, this is Marina, by the way.
I'm ready.
That I really liked how you had a full list of potential job opportunities and fields of career options that will be potentially opening up. You know, that was really eye-opening to kind of see the diversity in what's available for future generations and whatnot. I screenshotted it because I feel like that's worth sharing on Facebook, you know, or somewhere, anywhere that the younger people are going to be paying attention and saying, you know, that's really valuable information.
Thank you. That was, you had to wade through all the beginning to get to that, which was the whole point of it. So thank you for wading through it and appreciating it and recognizing that that was just the little bit that I could come up with after a few hours of thinking in a beer and some discussions with friends, but there's a whole lot more than that. And I suspect there are enough people on the call and here that could add to that list by a factor of 10.
Probably.
So
that,
you.
that was sent out.
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the economic development connection and green jobs. And I think that ties into a lot of things, including our educational resources right here.
Right.
And particularly in a economy, a local economy like Brookings and Ford County, I think not to say that there are no longer jobs in forestry, fishing, et cetera, but it's something that's diminished over the decades and needs to be enhanced by some smart green job technology development. So I think I applaud that. So it's great.
Well, that's why I think that the challenges of the resources and the loss of jobs, or the reduction in the number of jobs, sort of evolve into how can we get those jobs back and do it the right way? Because just thinking, Chris and I are involved in offshore wind, and the premise of the group is it's got to be sustainable and it's responsible development. And that responsible means that you're taking care of all of the issues, not having a big company come in and say, we're going to do this and that's it. It's how do you make sure that the kids here that love the ocean, the people that have boats that would love to continue to do that and fish a bit, not have that loss, but maybe run crews out to do maintenance. If you're having literally tens, dozens to hundreds of these things out there, that's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to require support on site. It's going to take support here. The challenges could then come to the realtors or the developers on land. How will we make sure we have the right resources here to support that activity out there? Or for the fishing, when can you change people's ideas about what's the best fish to have in January or in June when the fish stocks has changed? You know, do we have to bring it down for Alaska? Or maybe there's something that if it's common enough here and we're not having to ship it to another market because they're used to it, that would be great. So the opportunities to figure that out are huge.
So Bill, I'd just make a comment after watching your presentation. The first parts of it were great, going through all the different aspects of what's causing greenhouse gas pollution and what we could do about it once it's already here. But I come away with the overarching view that it's really complicated. There's an enormous amount that needs to be done. And I don't get the sense that our pace of success is at a rate that is going to get us where we want to be. What do you think it's going to take to basically switch that around, switch the conversation around so that it becomes a high enough priority globally that these things actually get solved in a timely manner?
Well, not to put the US as the linchpin to it, but I think we actually are. And that there are plenty of other countries, including China and India, that are doing way more than we are. If you're talking competition against US and China, their investment in research and development on solar, on artificial intelligence, on other renewables is way beyond what ours is. We need to get that going again. Now, in asking your question or answering your question in terms of what's it going to take, I hate to think that it's going to take a real jolt. But if you're aware that we right now, including Brookings, but especially Southern Oregon and so much of California, are in a mega drought. And it's, what is it, Lake Mead? It's behind Hoover Dam, has never been this low since it's filled in 1936. It's like, holy gee, that's a problem. And when you realize that California is what I think they produce 80% of the world's supply of almonds, and now people are moving away from dairy and getting almond milk. And so it's like, okay, there is a very real chance that we could see a spike of grocery costs, food costs, because of the lack of ability to grow the foods in California. And so between that and forest fires, as people lose their homes, as people can't breathe, as you have the hurricanes that are on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, that's a wake-up call. It's interesting, I was reading just the last day or two about a group of Republicans, young Republicans, that are saying, no, this climate change stuff is real. We have to do something about it. And so it's a difference. There's apparently a shift, or there's sort of a battle within Republican parties, well, for a lot of things, but in this case, saying this is serious, this is our legacy. We want to make sure that we do something more than just say, doesn't exist. We're not going to worry about it. It's just going to cost money. Recognizing that it's going to cost money, but the sooner we invest that money, the sooner we're going to come to a solution. It's interesting, if you stop and think what you were doing when you first bought a book from Amazon. We were in Australia, and Vicki was in a book club, and it was tough getting books over to Australia. They have books there, but they wanted to, because it was a group of Americans there, expat community like you're familiar with. And so they run a book club. It was a lot easier to get a Kindle, download the books, and everybody had them. And that was when Amazon was a bookseller. And that was before Jeff Bezos became the richest person in the world. And so it's like, okay, that was 10 years ago. So it's like, holy crap, things have changed a lot. There's a really interesting short video that shows a picture in 1900 or 1901, picture of New York. And that picture, it shows it was all but one of the vehicles were horse-drawn carriages. They said you could see the little car over the side. 10 years later, there was one horse in the picture. All the rest were cars. And so can the change happen fast? Absolutely. You know, when you talk to your kids about what it was like to have 3 pictures or 3 channels on the TV. Well, that's a long time ago, but it seems to be evolving so fast. The pace of change is so fast right now. We're not used to that. That's not our generation. But the younger generation thinks, well, of course that's so last May.
Yeah.
Like, okay. And so harnessing that, taking advantage of it, but then making sure that we balance that against what are the real world problems? How do we make that not be a problem, but how do we get to a new solution? And so it's great because it requires a balance between the new people that want to say, got to do it right now, we're going to change, and the oldsters saying, well, think about this, think about that. Both have to come to a solution. So the change can happen. But I'm afraid that the point you're going toward is that we're going to see some significant calamities before we get everybody on board for this. I was heartened to see that some of the younger Republicans have a caucus that are saying we got to deal with it. So there's hope.
Yeah.
It's going to be 106 degrees in Portland tomorrow.
Yeah.
And, I wonder, it's a given, or basically of the fact. Energy use and consumption, but is there really a lot of cost benefit analysis being done in the environmental world on that? Because I grew up in Washington State and relied a lot on hydroelectric power and energy, and huge aluminum industry in Washington State. Take aluminum cans are easily recyclable, but what are the costs involved in producing aluminum can?
Yeah.
Or, in terms of transportation, you mentioned delivery. I think, not talking specifically about aluminum now, just delivering, oil pipelines. What are the delivery costs compared with benefits? Or obviously this latest one just went down in flames, or pipeline, that had been natural gas.
No, that was tar sands from Alberta. Alberta?
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Dakota.
I just wonder how much is being done in terms of cost benefit analysis.
Well, it's interesting, and that's why I said there are all these different industries that have to be working together, financial, and doing the cost benefit, the modeling, and all. There's public-private partnerships, and how do you balance this out, balance the risk, balance the opportunities, getting government to make sure it sort of set the policies and let the free market do what the free market should do without going crazy and having things unbalanced. I mentioned about reusing or repurposing existing infrastructure, capitalizing on the knowledge base that we've had from other industries, whether it's aerospace to figure out how do you really get the planes off the ground and then let them glide. I mean, Boeing apparently just signed up for a bunch of supersonic airplanes. It's like, is that really where we need to be going? Putting the effort into something that gets you there twice as fast. And your pollutants are way up in the atmosphere and have even more of an effect. So
one other thing, going back to my growing up in Seattle, I was riding around on electric buses, you know, with the wires above when I was a kid. Yeah, you know, preferable, I suppose, to diesel, or, you know, but what are the trade-offs and the cost benefits of things like that, you know? So it's way more complex. I don't have any answers. Hopefully scientists like you are getting closer, but yeah, I'd really like to see more of that.
Well, that's why if you are excited about things, watching what's going on, and I subscribe to all sorts of feeds, and so I'll take an hour looking at everything from the New York Times and Washington Post to Inside Climate Now, the Climate News, Skeptical Science, all these different things focused on my particular focus is on climate. And so it is exciting. It is, you have to balance it because it can be kind of depressing for the fact that I'm afraid that to get too many people, get enough people, get that critical mass going, it's going to take some nasty things, kind of like it would take to get over anti-vaccine concerns for a pandemic. It's like, oh, okay, so what more do you need? We already know.
It's comparable, yeah. I think the two,
Yeah, and so the lessons I've asked people. So, what was the silver lining in COVID? We are doing something to silver lining from COVID. Because when that happened, we missed one presentation. That was Shannon and Souza talking about offshore wind. No, Shannon was talking about the grid, I think it was. But we then switched to Zoom. And for the benefit or the detriment, everybody that's on the phone now, everybody that's going to listen to the recording now will have that opportunity that we wouldn't have had otherwise. We were trying to push it that way, but this was kick in the pants to make it happen. So those sorts of little kicks in the pants, those things that have pushed forward, we don't know. But if we can respond properly to it, we can capitalize on that and use the existing infrastructure, the existing knowledge, the understanding that things are different. So we may have to push up our risk tolerance a bit and try new things. But that sort of thing is what we got to get people going and get people excited. It concerns me to go to the high schools here and their kids that says, well, I just want a job where I can, go and do what I need and go home. But there's no connection, there's no excitement.
Hi, Bill, I don't know if you can see, Vicky and Karen have both taken themselves off mute. Do they have comments they want to add?
Thank you.
I remember a picture of New York City when they had all the electric poles running in New York City for lights and whatever. And then they buried the cables.
Yeah.
What a difference. The smog went away, the air was cleaner, everything, just by burying the cables.
Well, the disadvantage is, like Hank was saying, is that you bury the cables that are powering the buses, electric buses. And so there are the trade-offs, and you bring up a really good point, Vicki, in that there are those trade-offs. There is aesthetics and safety, and that's why there has to be the discussion. That's why we got to bring people in. That's why we have to make sure that somebody that feels marginalized and not part of the conversation has to be brought in and figure out what's right. There are going to be people that are absolute Luddites and say, no, this is bad. That's why I don't like the question of can we do it? Because it's a lot easier to say two letters of no than yes. If you say, how can we do it? You're not asking the can we, or yeah, you're not asking the can we. You don't get a no, because how can we do it sounds no. Like, that's kind of a dumb response to it. The other thing that I think that's really interesting, you were talking about as a kid, riding around in electric powered trolleys. I got my mom to give a few recollections about what she remembered from a kid. She was born in 1916, and she talked about riding around in Mrs. Baker's car. Mrs. Baker's car was an electric car. So that was in the mid 1920s. And that was a competition. Is it going to be an electric car? Is it going to be an internal combustion car? Obviously, internal combustion car won the slow part of the race, because now we're going to the electric car. So we'll see.
Well, I'm gonna get one when they become affordable.
And that's just it. And that's where, if somebody can figure out how to do that and have all the infrastructure behind it, there's a massive economic opportunity for that. There are a lot of us that are ready for it. They're just not going to be able to afford the top end Tesla. Karen, did you have a comment?
Yes, this is an opportunity to, you were started to reveal some of the sources that you read to keep up on everything. And I think there might be an opportunity for one of the future presentations to do that in an interesting way, telling stories that you've learned from this publication or that publication or this person. Because I think everybody wants to expand their reading list or their internet watching list to keep up with everything. So.
Well, to the extent that you're willing to listen to me drone on for another hour and a few months, whatever, I'd love to talk about that. Also love to talk about offshore wind, but I also want other people to talk. So let me use that as a jumping off point for saying, for everybody on the Zoom call, and again, all I see is a little eye up here. Unfortunately, Hank and Chris are here, so I know I've got a live audience, and Doug has popped in and out. So I've got a couple people that are live people. And first off is to say, hopefully everything will happen and we can open up, and July, everybody can be here, or anybody that can't be here, you still be on Zoom. We're going to keep that going, but you have a chance to be here. And the other part of it is, as you get re-engaged, we need more people for ideas of what topics should we talk about? What are things people are interested in? Whether it's some aspect of forestry, or what's new about fisheries, or regenerative agriculture. We're going to have next month is Kathleen Dixon, that's the founder and owner of Otterbees, is going to be talking about being a locavore. I put the flyer together and I misspelled it as locavore. And I asked, well, does that mean you're a crazy eater? Locavore is you eat locally, which is a great idea. And so that's the push to become locavores. So, and my question is if you guys, whoever's on the phone or whoever is hearing this, as you talk to other people, please have them contact me or talk to anybody who you eventually get to the right spot to join us, to get ideas of what are other things to do? What are other things you'd like to hear? What are other presentations? Because otherwise we'll run out of things, because my ideas are not that.
Hey, Bill, I have a suggestion. So kind of along the lines of the planning that we did for Earth Day last year that ended up getting canceled and all that. Yep. If there was some kind of Earth Day / job fair / education opportunity, or like to find out resources for people that want to go to college and, you know, are trying to figure out what they might be going for. If they had information on, you know, more focus on the renewable energies or, you know, anything that's going to be eco-friendly type of work, to have some kind of job fair that says, okay, these are the jobs that are hopefully going to be presented within the next 5-10 years or earlier, you know, depending on how long it takes to get educated. But to have those opportunities kind of spread out and shown, like, okay, here's where you can start, here's places where you need to go to make your connections, you know, something like that, to integrate all these different things into one would be super convenient.
I think you've hit on a topic that is near and dear to Karen's heart, to Doug's heart, because it combines education, outreach to the community, trying to get kids excited. I pointed out to Karen and Doug because we got together on Monday to talk about what can SWOC do to get kids excited, get programs that are useful, that are interesting. That seems like another sort of SWOC and beyond, or other sorts of program that can both be productive for the community and show how valuable SWOC is to the community.
Oh,
So,
absolutely. Yeah, I think it'd be a great opportunity.
and that's where the more people we have engaged in something like that, spread the work out so that we can have better ideas than just a few people. That would be very helpful for energy. So I very strongly support that.
Hey, Bill, I know you're down to the last minute or so of time, but I want to mention a couple of things. One, when you talk about wind energy and the oceans, I think some people miss that we have a transportation problem, not a production problem. Wyoming can produce a ton of electricity. They can't transport it to any place that needs it. So, and we can get all that wind energy that we can produce off the coast, but unless somebody lets us bring it ashore and it hooks to the grid somehow, and then goes into those high voltage power lines, you know, there's got to be some give and take. Some people got to be willing to let there be high voltage power lines, you know, which environmentalists tend to be against. I also wanted to mention, you mentioned airplanes. GE, I saw an article says that they can get another 20% efficiency. They're looking at some open turbine engines being in the future in development. I think those are pretty cool. And I wanted to mention one more thing is that I look at all these wood chips that get shipped out of Coos Bay, and that we see the chip trucks going up. When will we find a way to compress and glue or whatever those into cinder blocks, pine blocks, you know, much like cinder block building used to be? And doesn't that sequester some of that carbon? I mean,
Certainly.
And, you know, so how high do lumber prices really have to get before we start seeing that kind of innovation?
And that's where, as Hank was saying, where's the cost benefit analysis? How can we do this? And sometimes if you have somebody that's innovative in a business sense, knows how to manage things and get things going, what was not cost effective 3 years ago is suddenly cost effective, because some chemists said, oh, well, we just have to do this and this. And whoa, we dropped the cost by a factor of 10, everything turned on its head. So things can change very fast. I'll just live one last story for me. It was about 15 years ago, I was working on, and there are a few people that'll go, LNG. It was a project bringing LNG from Australia into Southern California, actually into Los Angeles Airport, but wasn't for the airport. But that project turned from being a really economically viable project to being absolutely no way it could happen because of fracking, hydraulic fracturing, and US started producing a massive amount of natural gas. Now, irrespective of all the issues around natural gas and fracking and such, the fact that the economics turned totally on its head within about 3 years. And so again, things can happen very quickly when a little innovation happens. It took about 4 or 5 years from the fracking to go something that could work. A couple little changes and everything was different. So I think that it's going to take some, unfortunately, some big events, maybe a number of us stuck together, but there is hope. And then can we get the political will? Can we get the groups of all the divergent groups together to have the conversations? We have to. And so we should. So now I hate cutting off discussions. I love starting the discussions. So, but I'm also hungry and I need something, some of that single plastic one. But I very much encourage you, because if we could have monthly presentations and have other just discussions, sitting around and talking about these ideas, just to share resources and experience and start discussing with our neighbors, start discussing with people that might be wearing red hats with funny letters on them. And I think Chris has got a really good experience of having spent an entire couple of days fishing with guys with rather different political views, starting that conversation because we're all in it together. So, I thank everybody for joining us and let us know.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was really good.